relentless, merciless, unforgiving, and unyielding. In previous episodes, we've talked about some pretty crazy stuff. Everything from the Siritan war machines to the insanity that is the Siritan Navy. And perhaps one of the most insane things was that of the Molten King Duran, which, looking back on it, I didn't really explain his capabilities that well. But, regardless, we've talked about one of the Siritan calamities, and unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, there's another character that we need to talk about amongst the calamities. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Astral Lord, Raymond Ulcia. To start this off, we need to know a bit of background about Raymond. Raymond has been around for a long time. That should be unsurprising at this point. However, aside from Baylor and Faust, he really is one of the youngest calamities. He's not been around nearly as long as them. That being said, he has been around significantly longer than, say, somebody like Benimaru. Benimaru's been around for a very long time, but he only recently came into Shattered Legacies after the conclusion of the Ruin War. Raymond's story starts on a world known as Ulcia. Now, this should be known that this is before the events of the Ruin War. As a result, the Ulcia that we are talking about isn't the same as the Ulcia within the current lore. Within current lore, Ulcia is the Siritan Empire's throne world. It's one of the most important planets within all of the Siritan Empire's territory. However, this older version of Ulcia was nothing more than a backwater world. It was certainly a glitter world. It wasn't a standard or a rim world, but it was the kind of glitter world that nobody really ever heard of. The type of planet similar to modern-day Earth, where people lived and died on this world, never truly exploring and going outwards into the wider Siritan Empire. Now, one thing that needs to be known about Raymond back then is that he was an incredibly kind and compassionate individual. In fact, for nearly 40 years straight, he got one of the Siritan Empire's most difficult to achieve awards, known as the Golden Heart. The Golden Heart is given to the individual who shows the most kindness and compassion within the Siritan Empire, whilst also donating the most amount of money to nonprofits and charities throughout the entirety of the Siritan Empire. It's not too uncommon for centuries, millennia to go past where not a single person is capable of getting this award. It's not mandatory that somebody is given this award every single year. Rather, it's a specific criteria that you have to reach. As a result, the majority of the Siritan Empire, while certainly kind and compassionate towards one another, nobody was really ever standing out. Nobody was worthy of the Golden Heart. That is until a certain 39-year-old Siritan on the backwater planet of Ulcia proved himself. Raymond was incredibly rich, even amongst the Siritan Empire's elite, and this is due to the fact that he was one of the executives within Jackson Corp at the time. Now, we've talked about Jackson Corp in the past. They're essentially the company that has monopolized almost every single consumer good imaginable and keeps it at dirt cheap prices, whilst also having the highest quality possible. As a result, Raymond had a lot of money to throw around. In fact, well over 75% of all of his salary was dedicated towards nonprofits. However, after this 40-ish year-long period, he eventually stepped down. You see, when an individual believes that they have what it takes to earn the Golden Heart Award, they essentially enter themselves into a sort of almost like a competition. And then the agency that is in charge of the Golden Heart kind of judges everybody based off of their compassion as well as the amount that they donated. For 40 years in a row, Raymond had won this award. However, he eventually stepped down, stating that he believed that what he was doing was starting to get to the point of greedy due to how many times he had won it, and decided that he was going to relinquish his ability to receive the award. After that, nobody's ever gotten the award again. After this, nearly 30 years go by, and Raymond is roughly hitting his middle-aged years. One important thing about Ciritans is that through genetic modification, their average lifespan is anywhere between 120 to well into 200 years old. Now, this seems like a massive gap, but the majority of Ciritans will live roughly in the middle, maybe 140, 145. In exceptionally rare cases, Ciritans can live all the way out to 200 years, and in incredibly unfortunately rare situations, they may only last until 125. This isn't a fault in modern medicine, nor is it a fault within their genetics. Nobody's entirely certain why this happens, but it does happen from time to time. Regardless, Raymond at this point is relatively middle-aged, this being roughly 30-odd years since he relinquished his ability to gain the award. It's at this point that Raymond suddenly and spontaneously disappears. In fact, it was directly in front of his wife, which he does have a wife and a daughter. His wife, it's that stereotypical they got lost in the forest type of situation. They were standing in their house, and his wife turned around for less than a second to look at her daughter to make sure that she was doing what she was supposed to be doing, whatever that may have been. Upon turning back around to look at her husband, Raymond was gone. Less than a second had gone past. There is no conceivable way that he could have gotten out of the house, let alone completely undetected, in less than a second. Yet, he was gone, and nobody had any idea as to where he could possibly have gone to. After this, a nearly 4-year-long search was initiated. People knew that he had to be somewhere on Ulcia. There's no possible way that he could have gotten off-world. So for 4 years, the entire population, due to just how important Raymond was, scoured the planet, and unfortunately they had to call off the search simply because they had pretty much searched every single corner of the world and had yet to find him. Ironically enough, it was the day after the search was called off that Raymond spontaneously reappeared, standing just outside of his house. Needless to say, his wife and daughter were ecstatic, and the community as a whole were relieved that he was still around, but also kind of concerned as to how he just spontaneously appeared. It was almost like you blinked, and suddenly Raymond was just standing there. Unfortunately, this was the prelude to something unbelievably horrible. Nobody's entirely certain what happened, and if what Raymond says is to be believed, even Raymond isn't fully aware of what happened during that period of time that he just disappeared. However, one thing that we can confirm is a complete and utter personality change. He went from one of the most kind and compassionate individuals to a person who has absolutely no remorse, whether they be friend or foe on the battlefield. In fact, it was a total 180 compared to who he was. Interestingly enough, Raymond still had Ulcia in his heart. As a result, not long after he reappeared, he boarded a vessel and went to another planet. The exact planet that he went to is unknown, as at this time, whilst Raymond was certainly important to the Empire, his whereabouts were always monitored, and where exactly he departed to is widely unknown. However, what is known is that upon making landfall on the new planet, he unleashed a truly hellish level of destruction. You see, Raymond had never been particularly he was good at magic. He had a natural affinity at magic, and he was relatively above average, but he wasn't a prodigy. Furthermore, he saw absolutely no reason to study magic, let alone use it. It was never really something that he needed in his daily life. However, the level of destruction and the magic that he used would have been from somebody who had spent their entire life studying and dedicating themselves to magic. Now, Raymond himself wields gravity magic. Now, gravity magic, whilst relatively rare, is about as far from a unique type of magic as you can get without it being utterly common. As a result, Raymond is capable of using other types of magic, as this is simply, again, just standard gravity magic. That being said, the potency of these spells is on a level that nobody has ever seen before, but we'll get to that in a bit later. Eventually, Raymond went from world to world, causing complete and utter carnage as he continued along his warpath, seemingly caused from nothing. It didn't take long for the Siritan Empire to finally consider him to be an official and dangerous threat, and officially recognized him as the Siritan Empire's second most wanted individual. Now, there's an interesting thing about the most wanted list within the Siritan Empire. There are two lists. There is the planetary wanted list, and there is the Empire's wanted list. When it comes to a planetary wanted list, these are oftentimes low-level criminals. Criminals that you would see in the modern day. Imagine who would be on the most wanted list. There you go. Oftentimes, they're individuals who don't possess super Siritan levels of physical strength. They don't possess psionics. If they do possess magic, it's not particularly powerful, and they certainly don't possess divine capabilities. That being said, the threat is usually localized to the planet. As a result, Siritan law enforcement, in the form of the enforcers and peacekeepers, will be deployed to deal with the threat. That is until you make it on to the dubious list that is the Siritan Empire's most wanted. On this list, it is individuals that are far beyond, shall we say, normal. These are individuals who have incredible physical capabilities or magical, even psionic, and oftentimes standard Siritan law enforcement really just isn't the right call. It should be noted that Siritan enforcers are heavily armored and heavily armed. Whilst they have non-lethal weaponry, they are capable of putting some serious pain on anybody who defies Siritan laws. That being said, Siritan peacekeepers, whilst being essentially a sort of upgrade of the standard enforcer, are nearly on par with Siritan Marines. They are not individuals to be messed with. That being said, when you make it onto the Siritan Empire's most wanted, law enforcement has to step down. At this point, the Siritan military gets involved, as these are oftentimes situations where a military presence is all but required. That is, until you start getting to the top 10. When you get to the top 10, the standard military stands down and sends in its special forces, these being Siritan Marauders and Siritan Marines. However, when you start getting to the top 5, this is when things start getting really dangerous. These are the individuals who can easily hold their own against some fairly powerful individuals. Now, back then, the natural disasters weren't what we understand them to be now. The natural disasters, otherwise known as the Mages Corps, is the primary magic division of the Siritan military. However, back during this time in the lore, the natural disasters are what the calamities are. It was a collection of 10 individuals whose magical capabilities was usually quite literally on the level of natural disasters. Tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, anything of that kind of level. Mass devastation could easily lay waste to massive regions of land. As a result, when you get to the top 5, it's oftentimes a joint effort between one of the lower-ranking natural disasters and Siritan Special Forces. This includes all the way up to the most wanted individual, which was an individual known as Yuri Tahoe. However, Raymond, being the second most wanted, had a bit of a unique situation. You see, when it came to the old natural disasters, there was obviously 10 individuals. However, rank 6 to 10 were oftentimes considered to be the more replaceable individuals. They were certainly powerful. They were essentially on the level of the modern-day Mages Corps, but they weren't as plentiful as the Mages Corps. As a result, it wasn't too uncommon to send them into battle and for them to unfortunately pass away whilst on the battlefield. As a result, the Siritan Empire was constantly swapping them in and out. That being said, they were certainly very powerful and incredibly useful in a quick pinch, which is oftentimes when the Siritan Empire actually needed them. However, rank 1 through 5 were oftentimes the heavy hitters. These positions were always static. The same 5 individuals held these positions. Now, we've actually already talked about one of these positions, this specifically being the Molten King Duran, being the second natural disaster at the time. Yes, back during the day, there was somebody who was even more powerful than Duran. However, we need to remember that this is Duran a very, very long time ago. He wasn't nearly the insane powerhouse that he is now. That being said, even modern lore Duran would be hard-pressed to find a way to defeat the first Siritan calamity, this being an individual known as Rex. Now, Rex was a problem. We've actually talked about Rex a couple of times. When we went over the magic episode, we had specifically talked about an individual who had 2 traits, Immortal and Infinity. That was Rex. Rex was the very first person to achieve the title of King. Now, within Shattered Legacies, there are 2 versions of the term King and Queen. The first applies to either a singular faction or a singular world. In this type of situation, King and Queen is that of a monarch. They're a ruler. However, if somebody is seen as a king or queen amongst all of the major factions, with the exception of Florians, largely because the Florians typically don't get into politics, they're no longer a monarch. They're known as the kings and queens of reality. These are individuals who possess such tremendous levels of magic, physical capabilities, psionics, whatever it may be, that they are quite literally capable of warping reality around them and bending it to their will. They are the kings and queens of realities because, as I've said before in previous episodes, kings and queens do as they please. These are not individuals that you can simply just go up to and tell them what to do, because more than likely, you're probably going to be atomized in the attempt. Now, Duran is one of them. He is the Molten King. Interestingly enough, the Siritan Empress, Molly Jackson, who we haven't covered yet, is also one of these individuals. She is the Queen of Magic. Well, Rex just so happened to be the very first. He is known as the Crazed King, and he is the only individual in all of Shattered Legacies who has never once been defeated in battle. And he's fought everybody. He's even gone toe-to-toe with Legend, and he came out on top. Now, when we get to Rex's episode, which will probably be after we do our Ruin War, you'll kind of get an understanding of just how insane and how insanely powerful Rex really is. But, of course, this isn't the point. The point is that when Raymond was put on the Siritan Empire's Most Wanted, he was given a very special exclusion. This being that the top 5 natural disasters were the only individuals that were to ever engage Raymond. This is simply just due to how powerful he was at the time. He was capable of pulling his own weight and going toe-to-toe with these legendary individuals at the time. And unfortunately, it never really got anywhere. The battles constantly happened. Well, not constantly. It was fairly infrequent that one of the top 5 Ciberton natural disasters was in the area. As a result, it was largely just minimize the amount of damage that Raymond is going to do, because we know he's going to do some damage. Well, we fast forward an incredibly long time, and we get to not long before the prelude of the Ruin War. Now, there are some events that occur in the Ruin War, and there's 2 primary branches. We're not going to go deep into the Ruin War, but the first is called the Prelude, and this is basically the events that occur before what is known as the active war. And this is when things actually start noticeably happening, where every single faction starts to realize something is going down. This is before that Prelude, when things, nobody is aware that anything is happening, but gears are moving in the background. The Ruin War is coming. Raymond ends up getting cornered by Duran. They have an incredibly heated battle, no pun intended, given what Duran is capable of. And Duran actually manages to finally capture Raymond. Now, at this particular point in time, Raymond has really cooled off quite a bit. It's very rare for him to go on a rampage, but he's still one of the Ciberton Empire's most wanted individuals, so we still gotta put this guy behind bars. Only there was a bit of a problem. Raymond is powerful, incredibly powerful. So powerful that they had to throw Duran at him just to get him captured, which means that there is a non-zero chance that he's going to be able to break out of his containment cell. That might not be the right way of putting it, but basically, they can't just put him in a prison cell, because he can just simply use his gravity magic and escape. And even if they use anti-magic materials or set up some sort of anti-magic energy field, chances are he's going to find a way around it, because Raymond is incredibly intelligent. So the Ciberton Empire went with the next best thing. They suspended him in time. Now, this next part, you really have to question the logic of the Ciberton Empire. They decided that having him in one location, probably not the smartest idea. There could be somebody working alongside him, or even a group of individuals. So having him in a stationary location, probably not the smartest idea, because if they break him out, oh boy, it's going to be such a pain in the ass to throw him back in prison. So they decided to put his time suspension prison cell, quote unquote, aboard the HMSS Judgment of Dawn, the Ciberton Empire's biggest and baddest mega carrier, which, ironically enough, turned out to be the best possible chance for Raymond to survive. Because not long after this, the Ruin War kicked off, and eventually came to a close. The Ciberton Empire, or rather a new fledgling Ciberton Empire, gradually started to get its feet below itself and establish itself, and after many trials and tribulations, finally managed to get up into orbit, where they found the HMSS Judgment of Dawn. More importantly, they found Raymond. Now, there is one very important thing that we need to talk about, and that is something known as an Alcyon and Delcyon class AI. Now, these 2 different types of AI are very important to the running of the Ciberton Empire. First, we'll cover Delcyon. Delcyon is basically, think Cortana and the other AIs in Halo. Those are Delcyon, They have human-like, well, technically they're beyond human-like intelligence, but they have their own intelligence, their own personalities, their own emotions, their own thought processes, They are literally people in a digital form. They are human equivalent AI. Delcyon AI make up 99.99% of all AIs within the Ciberton Empire. In fact, there is only one AI that is not Delcyon class. Delcyon class are used for quite literally anything and everything, because they're so incredibly versatile. That being said, this next part we can take a fantastic example from the universe that Shattered Legacies was heavily inspired by, this being Warhammer 40k. Specifically, what is it called? The Adeptus Ministorum, I believe, if I'm getting my Imperium lore correctly, or correct. So basically, the Imperium of Man is absolutely bonkers massive. The entirety of Warhammer 40k occurs within the Milky Way galaxy. Not even just a singular planet or anything like that. No, the entire Milky Way galaxy is the playing field for the Imperium of Man, the Eldar, the Orcs, so on and so forth. All of the factions. And so, when you get to an empire that is that big, it becomes almost impossible to manage it in real time. First of all, the Imperium doesn't really have a good way of communication with one another. You know, they use psychers and navigators in order to send psyker messages between one another so that they can have some sort of, you know, message system over incredibly long distance. But the problem is that you're dealing with the warp. And the warp doesn't play nicely. More importantly, the warp doesn't follow the standard flow of time. As a result, one of the wild things about Warhammer 40k and the warp is that the Imperium utilizes the warp as transportation. They have ships, they raise a special type of shielding, and then they literally send themselves into the warp, which is basically the, like, biblical definition of hell. It's insane. And they just sail on through, and they pop right back out because the navigators, which are a special type of mutant, use something that is known as the Astronomicon, basically a giant-ass lighthouse on Earth, and they use that to navigate around the warp. Well, the thing about the warp that's interesting is that, like I said, the flow of time isn't the same within the warp. As a result, the trip, which would normally, in calm, when the warp is calm, might take 2 weeks. The problem is that depending on how much the warp wants to fuck with you, it could turn a 2-week transit into a 12-year odyssey, or you could quite literally arrive at your destination before you even departed your last destination. You can quite literally travel back in time in rare cases, and there's not really any way of controlling this, you know? So as a result, it's incredibly difficult to actually send communications. You know, the Imperium of Man doesn't really have a good system for this. They have the Adeptus Ministorum, which are in charge of relatively the day-to-day stuff. As a result, the Imperium of Man largely runs off of a planetary governor, which is basically like an individual that is in charge of the entire planet. Now, why is all this important? Well, the Siritan Empire does something very similar. They also have a form of planetary governor, an individual who's in charge of the entire planet, and it's their job to maintain the day-to-day going-ons of the entire planet. And then they send messages to the wider Siritan Empire, you know, saying, you know, this is our current status, you know, we need these supplies, or there have been these attacks on our planet, so we may need reinforcements, you know, so on and so forth. Only, even then, whilst the Siritan Empire has a fantastic long-distance communication system, it's not perfect, you know? They can't be on the other side of a universe and send a message and it is received instantaneously. Now, their transmission speed is significantly faster than, say, the Imperium of Man, but it still takes a very long time. You know, in that exact type of situation, if I'm on one side of the universe and I want to send a message to you when you're on the other side, the message might take, with the Siritan Empire's current technology, maybe 10, 12 hours to arrive. And that's an entire universe. If they're in system with one another, it's basically instantaneous communication. It's very convenient, but the technology is also incredibly advanced. Well, the Siritan Empire found a way around this technological problem, and this is by introducing the other class of AI known as the Alcyon class AI. As I said before, there is only one AI that is classified as Alcyon and not Delcyon. This being the AI known as Athena. Now, for anybody who knows Greek mythology, you may know that Athena is the goddess of knowledge. Of course, she's also the goddess of other stuff, but that's aside from the point. The Siritan Empire's Athena is based off a very similar premise, and it's basically the entire Adeptus Ministorum, only in one quote-unquote consciousness. Now, when it comes to AI, there's the theory that we have modern day AI, which is very simple. Even people who have truly been trying to create human-like AI intelligence, we're not at that level yet. And then there's the theory that there is a level where AI is on par with humanity, and then there's the idea that AI becomes superior to humanity. Well, you take that idea of AI being superior to humanity and you go several hundreds, maybe even thousands of times farther, and you have Alcyon. Alcyon basically has unlimited capacity of learning and processing power and capable of handling basically anything you give it. And that's exactly what Athena does. Whilst 99.99% of all AIs are Delcyon, the majority of Delcyon AI take over for maybe 35% of everything that AIs do. Everything else is handled by Athena alone. As a result, whilst, let's say you have a smart fridge in your house, more than likely you're probably going to have a Delcyon AI in there, but you might have an Alcyon. You might have Athena hooked up to it, which means that Athena can quite literally manage everything on your refrigerator, whilst also making sure that this void ship in the void of space is not going to hit this planet, while simultaneously making sure that this manufacturing machine is, let's say, machining the specific part exactly how it needs to, while she's also making sure that this Dyson sphere off in buttfuck nowhere is not about to collapse in on the star. She literally handles everything, so long as she has a proper connection to whatever it is. As a result, the relative day-to-day going on within the Siritan Empire that the Adeptus Ministorum would normally handle is solely handled by Athena. And the interesting thing is that if you've ever played Doom 2016, and I think it's either in the middle or near the end of the game, you end up encountering Vega, the AI on Mars, right? Yeah, Mars. The AI at the Mars base that is kind of in charge of everything. And when you actually find his core, it's this massive sphere inside of this incredibly cold room because it's putting off so much heat. Athena is very similar, only Athena doesn't have a fixed location within reality. The fact of the matter is that she's completely disconnected from reality, in such a way that she is housed within her own pocket dimension. And at the very core of her AI is a incredibly ancient device that the Siritan Empire don't know how it functions, that allows for the creation and sustainment of this pocket dimension. Furthermore, you have to gain Athena's explicit permission to be able to enter this pocket dimension, which means she can quite literally say nobody's allowed in here and nobody can get in. But of course, this isn't about Athena. The important thing, and why I went on this massive tangent, is that this entire time that the Ruin War has been going on, Athena's been primarily dealing with the complete and utter dumpster fire that is the Siritan Empire at this point, because everything is collapsing. But she's got one eye kind of just like angled ever so slightly so that she can see Raymond out of her peripheral vision, And when everything finally collapses, she basically just looks directly at Raymond and she's like, "You are now my primary focus. I'm not going to let you out." So basically, the fledgling Siritan Empire come across Raymond, and they finally get into contact with Athena, and she kind of sets it up for them. This was the former Siritan Empire's second most wanted criminal. The problem is that whilst almost every single individual within the natural disasters that was actually considered to be powerful, for the most part, survived the Ruin War, they had barely even a quarter of a planet's population and a few incredibly powerful individuals. They needed more bodies, basically. And if they could have a few more insanely powerful people, all the better. And so they basically forced Athena to remove, or at least partially remove, the time suspension on Raymond, and then they laid it out for him. You have two choices. You can either stay in this suspended state for the rest of eternity, or you can pledge allegiance to this new Cyberton Empire and help us and make sure that everything, doesn't turn into a giant dumpster fire like the last Cyberton Empire. Raymond agreed under one condition, that he is allowed to do whatever he pleases when he needs to. He will be given missions on a regular basis, and so long as it is something that he believes that he has to do in order to complete that mission, the Cyberton Empire will not involve themselves. Needless to say, this was a bit sketchy as all hell, but given the fact that they kind of needed his magic at that point, they basically said, alright, okay, but we're gonna watch you and make sure that you don't do something incredibly heinous. And Raymond at that point was like, whatever, I'm getting what I want. Do whatever the fuck you want. You can't stop me anyway once I get free from this thing. Well, they ended up releasing Raymond, and he ended up joining the Cyberton Empire as one of the brand new, newly formed Cyberton Calamities. Unfortunately, that's really all the backstory that we have about Raymond. A lot of it we just simply don't know, either because Raymond himself doesn't remember or he is intentionally hiding information from us. Which means we can now go over Raymond's magic and why he is an absolute monster to fight on the battlefield. Raymond, as I said before, wields gravity magic. Now, gravity magic, as I said before, it's rare, but it's not unheard of for people to have it. However, the sheer potency that Raymond has, it's wild. Like, he has created his own magic, which means, if I'm remembering the mage's skill correctly, puts him at the very least Magnus, maybe Archmage level, right then and there, because he's creating his own magics. But the thing is that whilst it takes an extraordinary amount of effort and focus on the part of other gravity mages, they are more or less capable of pulling off the spells that he can do, just not nearly as bombastic really isn't the proper word for this, but not nearly as amazing as what he can do. Now, Raymond's most infamous spell is known as the Null Field. And before you ask, no, it is not related to the Null Void. The Null Field is a bit of a weird spell, in all honesty. It's a spell that Raymond more or less is only really subconsciously aware of. He's fully aware that the spell exists. He's fully aware of how to cast said spell. But the spell is utterly bizarre because it's an autonomous spell. The spell will recognize whenever Raymond enters and exits battle and automatically activates. How exactly this happens? Nobody's really sure. Even Raymond isn't really sure. Even the Queen of Magic, Molly Jackson, isn't really sure. Certain spells are just kind of like that. They just can activate autonomously without input of their caster. How they do this, the fundamentals of magic are still relatively iffy at times, especially when it comes to situations like this. But regardless, what it does is it creates in a massive half circle, so basically in every single direction around Raymond, it creates these small pockets of ultra intense gravity. Now, the size of these pockets is completely randomized. The intensity of the gravity within them is completely randomized. And these gravity pockets are constantly blinking in and out of existence at all times all around him. And it goes out an incredibly long distance. It goes out maybe 70 to 100 meters away from his body. Now, an important thing to remember is that, like, if I ever make art of this, his gravity magic will obviously have a design. That way we can physically see it, we can understand what the hell it is that we're looking at. But the fact of the matter is that gravity doesn't really have a color. It doesn't really have a structure. So as a result, whilst we out of universe would be able to see his magic, in universe his magic more or less is invisible. Now, whilst you can certainly detect it with things like gravity detecting equipment, it's usually rather bulky and requires specialists in order to operate, and they're probably going to die before they can even use the device to figure out where the hell these gravity pockets are. As a result, null field is sort of like a invulnerability shield all around Raymond. Now, it isn't unheard of for spells to be able to get through this and get to the point where they could maybe harm Raymond, but it is exceptionally rare. Now, when we had talked about Duran has an ability that is very similar. In fact, the null field was actually created because of the existence of Duran's ability, which is known as thermal barrier. Now, thermal barrier is relatively interesting, and it's mainly subconscious as well for Duran. We talked about before that Duran's magic and trait melded together, his trait being that of thermospike, which constantly raises the ambient temperature around him to theoretical infinite levels. Well, because it melded with his magic, it allows him to regulate and adjust just how much heat is actually being produced. So whenever Duran isn't actively in battle, if you look at him, he just looks like a dude that's standing there. But if you know what you're looking for and you're focused enough, you can see an ever so subtle heat haze all around Duran. And this is because the thermal barrier is always active. It is gossamer thin, basically as thin as a strand of hair. You cannot see it, but it is always there. And the thing is that the instant that anything touches it, it immediately emoliates and loses all of its force. And wouldn't you know it, Duran is also immune to molten material touching his body. Because, of course he would be, but that's not surprising. He's literally a molten magic wielder. This is one of the reasons why Duran is so impossible to take down. He's immortal. He can die. If you shoot him in the head, he will die. But the fact of the matter is that even if you're a sniper and you manage to go completely unnoticed by anyone and you find the perfect angle, you find the perfect vantage point, you line up that perfect shot and you take that shot, the second that bullet or that energy particle or that energy beam or whatever it is that you're firing hits that thermal barrier, it immediately emoliates on contact, again losing all of its force and just plopping down to the floor. Well, now Duran is aware of you because there's molten material on the floor. Raymond's null Raymond's null field appears to be based off of this thermal barrier, and as a result, Raymond is more or less untouchable. Now, like I said, it's not completely unheard of for something to actually manage to get through, but it's basically impossible. The thing about calamities that we have to remember is that these are individuals who are on par with the highest pantheon of gods. They are considered to be gods in of themselves, despite being wholly mortal. As a result, they have certain things that go well beyond what normal mortals are capable of, and that's specifically their perception, or the speed of their perception. When something gets close to them and their body actually registers that it's in danger because of something, their natural perception of reality slows down to basically complete and utter standstill because their mind is working quite literally at light speed at that moment. And as a result, they can analyze what exactly is occurring and formulate a strategy around it. Now, the interesting thing that calamities can do is that they can accelerate their movement speed and their reflexes to light speed for a fraction of a second. if they try to go any longer, their mortal bodies will quite literally rip themselves apart because you're traveling at light speed. But this allows for the deployment of various different spells, or if their bodies are capable of reacting fast enough, they can quite literally deflect incoming attacks with their own body, quite literally moving at light speed for that, again, fraction of a second. As a result, this quite commonly happens with Raymond. And the way that this works is that when Raymond actually registers that something is a threat to him, wouldn't you know it, he of course has a backup. And this backup is known as the Midnight Cloak. And the Midnight Cloak is basically a gravity version of Duran's thermal barrier. Now, one thing I forgot to add about the thermal barrier is this. Duran is most famous for his ability known as Molten World. And it's not really a spell, despite the fact that it looks like a spell. What Molten World is Duran creates a second thermal barrier outside of the first one, and he expands that barrier near instantaneously to a specific preset distance, oftentimes this being anywhere between 10 to 40 miles. And the expansion happens basically instantaneously and is exposed to such insanely high temperatures that the second this quote-unquote pseudo-spell activates, the entirety of the terrain around Duran in every single direction quite literally explodes into molten material because of the insane temperatures it's exposed to. Interestingly enough, however, Molten World has a very specific restriction, and that is that it cannot affect living organisms, such as animals or people. It can still affect plants, obviously, but this even goes down to the level of, despite the fact that you're quite literally physically touching what is effectively lava at that point, you won't suffer any adverse effects. The limb that is in direct contact with it, it'll feel excruciatingly hot, but it isn't going to burn. It isn't going to melt. You can quite literally walk through lava so long as it is directly connected to Duran's spell, Molten World. Interesting thing. Well, like I said before, Raymond has the Midnight Cloak, which is a sort of a knockoff version of Duran's thermal barrier. It's basically the same premise. It's gossamer thin, basically the same width as a strand of hair, and it's insanely high gravity that is cloaked all over his body at that moment, and quite literally compacts things down so incredibly small that we would probably never be able to see it ever again, no matter what the size of the object that is getting compacted down is. An important thing to remember about Raymond's magic is this. The intensity of his gravity is directly proportional to the area of effect. The more area of effect that he wants the spell to have, the weaker the gravitational forces are. Now, it's oftentimes the difference between compacting something down to the size of a marble to compacting something down to the size of a grain of sand. At this point, it doesn't really matter. It's still an insta-kill, but regardless. A few of the other spells that Raymond has, and perhaps one of his most terrifying, is a spell known as Singularity, where he is capable of creating a completely modifiable black hole wherever he wants. Now, this black hole is completely, as I said, customizable. He's capable of changing exactly the gravitational strength of the black hole, what exactly it's capable of consuming, and specifically designating even individual objects that will be affected by the gravity of pulling it in towards the singularity. As a result, it's the only instance in which Raymond can quite literally just create a big-ass black hole in atmospheric conditions, which normally this would probably, I would assume, immediately rip away the atmosphere and probably annihilate the planet in a very literal sense. Only, as long as Raymond doesn't essentially put the planet and the atmosphere on the whitelist, the black hole can't absorb them. It can't destroy the planet. It can't absorb the atmosphere. However, he can set it so that the enemy army that he's in front of will more than definitely be consumed by the black hole, and it's utterly horrifying to watch because suddenly this big ass black hole is in the sky directly above you, and there's not a damn thing you can do. It's completely and utterly hopeless. There is nothing you're going to do to be able to stop Raymond from quite literally sucking you into a black hole. And he can specifically say, okay, I don't want this city destroyed, nor do I want any of their vehicles of war damaged. So I'm going to specifically set it so that only their soldiers are sucked into the black hole. And it does that. Now, there have been no gravity mages that have managed to come even close to casting this spell, and it is believed that it is classified as a unique spell. Now, we've talked about unique magics before. Unique magics are magics that are so insanely powerful that they have natural restrictions, such as Isaiah's Winter Magic and Duran's Molten Magic. They are such incredibly powerful and oftentimes volatile forms of magic that it quite literally is like, you can either have this magic and all of its capabilities, or you can't have it. But if you do decide to take it, you can't have any other type of magic, no matter what it is. Unique spells are a bit different, as a unique magic is oftentimes unique to the individual, but is also unique in that you can't use any other type of magic. A unique spell, on the other hand, is wholly unique to the individual who created it. As a result, it is theorized that no matter how powerful a gravity mage may become, they'll never ever be able to cast Singularity. There are a few other spells, such as another spell that he possesses that is known as Event Horizon. Event Horizon is an utterly terrifying spell, which at this point you should be getting relatively used to the term terrifying when it comes to these types of spells. It is basically a wave of condensed gravitic force that is quite literally just wiped across the entire battlefield, smoothing the terrain down to like perfect smoothness. And anything that is caught directly in the wave is just completely and utterly obliterated as a result. He has other spells that are known as Gravity Lance or Graviton Lance, which is just basically like a spike of gravitic force that he can just launch out in rapid fire at anything that he's looking at and basically quite literally turn it into Swiss cheese. Because the important thing to know about this is that it's basically like there are videos on YouTube of people who take like an oil drum, an oil barrel, and they start sucking the air out of the barrel. And it obviously doesn't have a way to bring air inside the barrel, so eventually it just kind of collapses in on itself. Now imagine that, only instead of it collapsing into the structure itself, I believe we talked about this with War Machines, it quite literally rips it apart and then packs it down like that, essentially like a black hole. His magic is utterly gnarly, and the thing is that Raymond really doesn't care who gets hit in the crossfire. You know, if it's something like Singularity, he'll obviously blacklist his own allies, but it's like anything else, if his allies get in the way, he will not stop. Like, if an ally just so happens to randomly be running in front of him when he's about to use Graviton Lance, he won't stop. He'll quite literally just drill the spell straight through that soldier just to take out the enemy. And he's very much the ends justify the means, no matter what it is. And it's just, he's such a dark, he's not quite evil, but he's about as close to evil as you can get without actually being evil, if that makes sense. Now, Raymond himself, when we talk about the calamities, we typically don't like, or I typically don't like giving them a very specific numerical value. And this is simply because at the end of the day, we don't really know how powerful these individuals are. The calamities aren't fighting one another because, good God, the level of destruction that could happen just from these idiots fighting one another is unfathomable. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the top three, we are aware because their powers are so far beyond that of 4 through 8. The most powerful should come as no surprise to you. It's Duran, because the dude is just bonkers powerful. Then you have Raymond, and Raymond is probably the only person who can get the closest to giving Duran an actual, a decent fight. He might make Duran sweat ever so slightly, a little bit of sweat on his brow, whew, that was a little bit of a close fight, but it's never going to come close to him losing type of situation. After that, you have the third Siritan calamity known as Mikhaila, which we'll probably be doing next episode because Mikhaila is equally insane. But there's one thing that I kind of want to go over, and that is, obviously, there is inspiration throughout all of Shattered Legacies. Everything has an inspiration, but some of them are less obvious than others. And some characters and concepts are quite literally, the concept or the inspiration was literally just a song or a type of music that I was listening to at the time. And I kind of want to go over some of the inspirations of these things. Now, obviously, the Siritan Empire and the other major factions were heavily inspired by Warhammer 40k. That should come as no surprise. Duran, I honestly don't remember where the inspiration came from. It was probably some random anime that I was watching at the time or something else, but if I remember correctly, Duran was never meant to be this powerful. But the fact of the matter is that I did make him this powerful, and honestly, I don't really have any regrets, because anybody who is getting exposed to Shattered Legacies, which is pretty much everybody, is immediately going to think, okay, so you have the Siritan Empire and the rest of the factions. Each of them has their own advantages, their own things that they can bring to the battlefield, but it seems like it's pretty much one-sided. Like, the Siritan Empire is always going to win. The fact of the matter is that no. Pretty much every single major faction has a solid chance of coming out on top. The Siritan Empire, I will admit, is the ones that typically come out on top, but, humanity is, aside from the Florians, probably the closest ones on a technological level to the Siritan Empire. If they play their cards right, they can somewhat easily win. The Barramon, if they just go out in pure full aggression, they could probably overwhelm the Siritan Empire. It would take them an asininely long time, but they could do it. The Avens are so focused on magic that a full-out magical assault involving their entire species would be incredibly damaging to the Siritan Empire, to the point where they would probably collapse. The Bastilians are very similar. If the Bastilians infiltrated the Siritan Empire, they could do a lot of damage in a very short amount of time. And as for the Florians, their technology and their bodies are so superior to the Siritan Empire, it does not take a lot of them to do a serious amount of damage. Every single faction has its own chance. As a result, when you hear about these calamities, you're like, this is absolute insanity. Why do characters this strong have to exist? This just seems like a total out of left field. Not only that, but the fact they're all within the Siritan Empire. You're right, but at the same time, you have to remember, this isn't armies. These are individuals. If it was the entire Siritan Empire's military that was on the level of calamities, first of all, oh dear God. Second of all, yeah, nothing could really stand up against them. But it's the same with the Mega Carriers and the Siritan War Machines. Yes, their power is so far beyond what the other factions have for the most part, but the fact of the matter is that they're limited by numbers. Yes, the Mega Carriers are practically indestructible and can annihilate entire assault fleets on their own, depending on which one you use, but there's only 5 or 6 of them. Yes, the Siritan calamities could easily annihilate planets on their own in a single engagement just because they got a little bit too into the fight. But again, there's only 8 of them. 8 people can't be everywhere at once, and this is one of the advantages that the other factions have. Yeah, if Duran or Raymond or Mikaela show up on the battlefield, there's not a goddamn chance in hell you're winning that fight. But guess what? It's going to take them a while to get to another fight because they have to get off world, and they have to get out of system, and then they have to spend all that time skip jumping to a brand new location to help out. In that time, you could do some fairly major damage to the front lines, especially if the Siritan Empire is solely depending on them, which isn't how the Siritan Empire functions. So as a result, it kind of balances them out. Yes, these individuals are so absurdly powerful that there's quite literally nothing that can stand against them other than each other, but they can't be everywhere at once. Now, if multiple are in one location, especially if the Siritan Empire is being pushed to the brink of destruction, yeah, that's a pretty big damn problem, but at the same time, there are still ways around it, When it comes to Raymond, I actually know the inspiration, and it was actually a song. A song from a video game known as Elden Ring. Now, there's probably quite a few people listening to this that know, at least in passing, what Elden Ring is. It's basically, as a person who's never played either game series, it seems like a new version of Dark Souls, basically. Well, there's a specific boss in Elden Ring known as Radahn. What was his full name? I think Star Scourge Radahn or something like that. And the inspiration for Raymond came from the first part of Radahn's song. And I just obviously I can't pull it up here because I'll probably get copyrighted into oblivion. Not that I really care, but you can look up the song on your own, and it's just, it fits Raymond so perfectly because the dude will just be, there's not an ally in sight. Like, the battlefield that he's walking onto is a barren, like, it could be like a desert. And the dude is walking forward towards the enemy formation alone. Completely and utterly alone. And the dude just pulls out his divine weapon and just goes ham on them, unleashing gravitic spell after hellish gravitic spell. The enemy has absolutely no hope of retaliation, no hope of defense. Everything is hopeless as their defenses continue to crumble as if they are made out of nothing more than wet tissue paper. And it's just, that's honestly the kind of feel that I want for each of the calamities, is that when these guys walk onto the battlefield, it's hopeless. There's no hope unless you have a person who can get on the same level as these titanic calamities. It's just hopelessness. The battle is lost before it's even begun because of just how insanely powerful these individuals are. There's no weapon that you can shoot at them that's going to take them down. There is no defense that is strong enough that is going to hold out against their onslaught. It is just pure abject hopelessness whenever you have to face one of these individuals. Let's see. Obviously, the Siritan War Machines were inspired by Warhammer 40k Titans, because Titans are cool. There's probably a couple of other things. The Siritan Navy was largely based off, interestingly enough, was inspired by some of the ship designs of StarCraft 2, the Protoss ships. Some of them were kind of inspired by that. Some of them were Eldar ships, their world ships, or Worldcraft, or whatever the fuck they're called. I don't remember. I don't listen to Eldar stuff because I don't care about them. But a lot of it was based off of Warhammer 40k. So I think at the end of these episodes, I'm going to start saying, if I remember what the inspiration was, kind of what the inspiration is, and the thought process that I had behind it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you guys are looking forward to the next episode of Shadow Legacies Deep Dive coming out next Tuesday. We also have, as long as I'm not busy or just don't feel like it, our live streams on Saturday and Sunday, noon Central Standard Time, where we're doing RimWorld and Sunday Night Live, respectively. Sunday Night Live being where I pick a random game, and we just game it out for 2 weeks. Still haven't recorded the new series. I might do that this week. I might push it out until next week. I'm going to have to see, simply because this is Thanksgiving week. So yeah, there is that possibility. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys are looking forward to the rest of whatever the hell is going on. So until then, guys, see ya.